Imagine a king who dared to defy destiny. Stephen of Blois was never meant to be a monarch, but when opportunity knocked, he seized it without hesitation. The throne of England was an ambitious prize, a symbol of power that many coveted, but the crown never comes without a price. Betrayal, war, and a kingdom plunged into chaos became the defining elements of his reign. At the heart of this conflict lay the Anarchy, one of the most turbulent periods in English history. A king without absolute control, a rival determined to reclaim her right, and a country ravaged by warlords and rogue castles. It was a time when the very idea of legitimacy was put to the test, and England became a vast chessboard where nobles played with human lives. But in the end, Stephen achieved something that many kings failed to accomplish: a peaceful transition of power. But how did he reach that point? How did a luckless warrior, marked by both victories and defeats, manage to hold on to the throne until his final breath? And how did this brutal struggle shape the future of England? Origins and early life. The fate of Stephen of Blois was set into motion long before his coronation, in an era where loyalty was measured by the edge of a sword, and a king's legitimacy was challenged with every beat of a war drum. The son of Adela of Normandy and Count Stephen Henry of Blois, he was born sometime between the years 1092 and 1096, in a Europe where ambition shaped dynasties and power was never secure. His grandfather was none other than William the Conqueror, the man who had subjugated England. But keeping a kingdom was far harder than winning it. His father, like many nobles of the time, had sought glory and redemption in the First Crusade. But instead of returning a hero, he met his death on the sun-scorched battlefields of Palestine. And so, the responsibility of shaping young Stephen's future fell to his mother, Adela, a woman of sharp intellect and royal blood. Under her guidance, Stephen grew up in a world where faith and politics were inseparable. He studied Latin, history, and the arts of knighthood while observing the intricate web of power struggles that dictated the fate of kingdoms. But what truly molded him was his close connection to his uncle, King Henry I of England. Seeing potential in the young noble, Henry granted him lands and titles, preparing him for a future that even Stephen himself could not have foreseen. Yet, in the ruthless courts of medieval Europe, favors were often disguised traps, and gratitude frequently turned into betrayal. Stephen's rise to the throne would not be a tale of honor and tradition. It would be a dangerous game of usurpation and anarchy soon to be unleashed. Claim to the throne. When Henry I breathed his last in December of the year 1135, the succession should have been clear. His daughter, Matilda, had been sworn as his heir by the nobles years before, and she was meant to take the throne. But medieval England was not a kingdom where promises held more weight than the sharp edge of a sword. Stephen, who was in Normandy at the time, moved with astonishing speed. He crossed the English Channel amid a storm of conspiracies and, with the decisive backing of his brother, Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, secured control over the royal treasury. London, seeing in him a chance for stability and perhaps an opportunity to negotiate privileges, welcomed his claim. Within days, Stephen was crowned King of England, breaking the oath sworn to Matilda and planting the seeds of a war that would consume the realm. However, a hastily seized throne is never a secure one. Though he initially had support, Stephen quickly realized that his position was fragile. His reign was not legitimized by an unquestioned lineage, but rather by the backing of nobles who saw him as a useful pawn for their own ambitions. Betrayal lurked in every shadow, and the early years of his reign became a desperate attempt to consolidate power before his enemies had the chance to strike back. On the horizon, Matilda and her allies, including the formidable Robert of Gloucester, were preparing for a return that would turn England into a battlefield. Stephen's reign would not be one of undisputed glory, but one of constant siege, where every victory only led to another challenge. Matilda's challenge. Fate does not delay in collecting its debts. Matilda, daughter of Henry I and rightful heir to the throne, did not accept Stephen's usurpation without a fight. With the support of her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, she launched a campaign to reclaim what was hers by right. By the year 1138, the war had truly begun. The kingdom was split in two. On one side, Matilda's supporters, who saw her as the legitimate continuation of the Norman dynasty. On the other, Stephen and his allies, who justified his coronation as a necessary act to prevent chaos. But ironically, it was this very conflict that plunged England into one of its darkest times, known as the Anarchy, an era where treachery, siege warfare, and political instability became the rule of the game. Stephen struggled to maintain control, but each new battle seemed to erode his authority. He faced attacks not only from Matilda and her allies, but also from opportunistic nobles and neighboring kings, such as David I of Scotland, who seized the chance to invade northern England. Meanwhile, Geoffrey of Anjou laid waste to Normandy, further weakening Stephen's power base. This war was not merely a struggle between two rivals for the throne, it was a fight for the very stability of England. And in the midst of this turmoil, loyalty was a volatile currency, shifting hands as quickly as the wind. Stephen had taken the crown, but now he had to prove he was strong enough to keep it. Civil war and political chaos. Fate was merciless to Stephen. In the year 1141, at the Battle of Lincoln, he suffered a disaster that would mark one of the darkest moments of his reign. His army, though numerous, was poorly positioned and was utterly crushed by the forces of Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester. As his allies fled or fell in battle, Stephen remained, fighting with ferocious determination. It is said that after losing his sword, he wielded an axe, and when that broke, he grabbed a simple club. But bravery was not enough. He was captured and taken to Bristol, where he spent months imprisoned. For many, this seemed to be the end of his reign. A defeated king, a usurper on the brink of being dethroned. But the game was not over yet. Matilda marched on London, ready to be crowned queen, but her rule lasted little more than a breath. Arrogant and dismissive of the expectations of the nobles and the people, she quickly provoked a rebellion against herself. Meanwhile, Stephen had an unexpected savior, his wife, Matilda of Boulogne. With the cunning of a true strategist, she gathered troops, besieged Winchester, and captured Robert of Gloucester, the very keystone of the Empress's campaign. Then fate delivered a shocking twist. A king exchanged for a general. Stephen was freed, Robert remained a prisoner, and the war, well, the war was far from over. For those eager to dive deeper into the story of Stephen of Blois and the chaos that defined his reign, King Stephen by Edmund King is an excellent read. This book explores his rise to power, the brutal civil war, and how he shaped medieval England. A must-read for anyone fascinated by an era of treachery, battles, and the fight for the throne. The Anarchy's devastation. What followed was not just a war, but a complete collapse of order. England plunged into chaos, a period so lawless and brutal that it became known as the Anarchy, a name given by medieval chroniclers themselves. Nobles broke their oaths, looted villages, built castles without royal permission, and ruled their lands like petty kings. Law? Justice? These became little more than cruel jokes. Christ and his saints slept, lamented the monks, watching as the kingdom burned, ravaged by pillaging, famine, and treachery. The fields were scorched, the roads overrun with bandits, and Stephen's crown, though still on his head, meant little in the face of absolute disorder. Royal authority was shattered. As Stephen desperately tried to reaffirm his rule, Matilda strengthened her strongholds in the west. The country was divided, split like a broken kingdom. In some regions, Matilda's name was law. In others, Stephen was still recognized as king. But in truth, no one really ruled. The nobility, seizing upon the throne's weakness, shifted alliances at will, each lord fortifying his own domain while the English crown continued to weaken. Matilda and Stephen fought battles, besieged castles, negotiated truces, but no victory was ever permanent. Time passed, and a question loomed over England. Could a kingdom torn apart by treachery and war ever be restored? A stalemate and negotiation. The years passed, and what had once been a war driven by passion and ambition became a burden for both sides. No victory was ever final. No conquered territory was truly secure. The conflict had turned into a war of attrition, where the only certainty was destruction. Stephen, now older and weary, watched his son Eustace grow up in the shadow of war, expecting the day he would inherit the crown. But fate, relentless as always, had other plans. In the year 1153, Eustace died suddenly, leaving Stephen without a direct heir. With his strength fading and no clear successor to secure his dynasty, the king began to consider what had once seemed unthinkable: a peace agreement. On the other side stood Henry of Anjou, the son of Matilda and heir to the Plantagenet dynasty, rising as an inevitable threat. Charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious, he had inherited his mother's resilience and his father's vast dominions. His name was already being whispered among the barons as a possible solution to the deadlock that had paralyzed the kingdom. By this point, everyone was exhausted by war, even those who had started it. England needed a strong king, a legitimate ruler who could restore order. But would Stephen be willing to recognize the son of his greatest rival as his successor? The fate of the kingdom depended on his next decision. Treaty of Wallingford. The year 1153 marked the end of an era of chaos. After nearly 2 decades of war, Stephen and Henry of Anjou finally reached an agreement, the Treaty of Wallingford. The price of peace was steep but unavoidable. Stephen would remain king until his death, but he would recognize Henry as his rightful heir. It was a pact between enemies who despised each other, yet understood that the kingdom's destruction served no one. The treaty not only secured the Plantagenet succession, but also brought a momentary relief to a kingdom torn apart by sieges, betrayals, and unchecked ambition. Even so, not everyone was satisfied. Many of Stephen's supporters still wanted a Blois on the throne, while Matilda's partisans wished for a more humiliating downfall for the usurper. But the treaty was clear. No more wars, no more disputes, no further claims to the throne. The anarchy had come to an end, and with it, Stephen entered the final years of his reign. Now, all that remained was to wait for the inevitable, the day Henry of Anjou would ascend the throne as Henry II. But could a kingdom ravaged by so much war and betrayal ever truly recover? Death and legacy. Stephen of Blois, the king who dared to challenge fate, died on the 25th of October in the year 1154, taking with him the weight of a reign consumed by war. His body was laid to rest in Faversham Abbey, a final gesture of devotion to the Church, but also a symbol of the end of a monarch whose life had been shaped by relentless conflict. Yet his legacy did not die with him. The England Stephen left behind was not the same as the one he had inherited in the year 1135. The land was scarred, castles stood as private strongholds, and royal authority was fractured, a fitting reflection of the anarchy. But his reign was not just an era of destruction. In the end, Stephen managed to ensure a peaceful transition to the Plantagenets, preventing the kingdom from descending into yet another cycle of civil war. His name may not be remembered with the same prestige as other monarchs, but the truth is, he was a king who fought until his final breath to keep his dynasty in power. And what legacy could be more enduring than that of a man who, against all odds, dared to defy fate itself? Stephen's reign was a roller coaster of challenges, betrayals, and relentless battles, where the legitimacy of the crown was tested like never before. Amidst the chaos, he fought to maintain his throne, facing a brutal civil war, the unyielding ambition of Matilda, and a kingdom fragmented by rebellious nobles. In the end, his victory did not come through the sword, but through negotiation. By recognizing Henry II as his heir, he forged a pact that finally brought stability to England. But this story does not end here. What happened when Henry II finally ascended the throne? He inherited a kingdom in ruins, but instead of merely ruling, he forever changed the way England was governed. Do you want to know how? In the next video, we will explore the rise of Henry II, his reforms, and the challenges he faced in consolidating his power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, we uncover the most fascinating intrigues of the past, the strategies of great leaders, and the moments that changed the world. Leave a like and comment. Which historical figure should we cover next? Let's continue this journey together.